The city had long since gone quiet, but he hadn't. While the world slept behind glowing windows and locked doors, Keanu Reeves moved through the empty streets like a shadow that didn't quite belong to the night, yet understood it better than anyone else. There was no entourage, no flashing cameras, no noise, just the low hum of an engine and the soft whisper of tires against asphalt. To most people, he was a name that echoed through theaters, a face projected onto giant screens. But out here, beneath dim streetlights and an open sky, he was just a man riding through silence, searching for something words could never quite explain. His motorcycle wasn't polished for show. It carried the marks of time, tiny scratches, worn leather, the faint dullness of metal that had seen too many miles to count. But to him, it was perfect. Not because of how it looked, but because of what it held. Every ride was a quiet ritual. He would start the engine slowly, almost respectfully, like waking an old friend. The vibration beneath him wasn't just mechanical. It was grounding, real, something he could feel when everything else in his life felt distant, scripted, or out of reach. And then he'd ride. No destination, no plan, just movement. The wind pressed against him, tugging at his jacket, brushing past his face like a reminder that he was still here, still present, still breathing in a world that often tried to pull him away from himself. There was something about the night that made everything clearer. Maybe it was the absence of noise. Maybe it was the way the city revealed its quieter side when no one was watching. Or maybe it was the way memories found him out there, uninvited but never unwelcome. Because they always did. In the stillness of those rides, fragments of the past would rise gently to the surface. Not loud or overwhelming, just enough to be felt. A laugh carried by the wind. A voice that lingered longer than it should. A moment frozen somewhere between joy and loss. He never tried to push them away. Instead, he leaned into them, letting the rhythm of the road carry both the weight and the warmth of everything he'd been through. The motorcycle became more than motion. It became a bridge. Between who he was and who he used to be. Between pain and peace. There was one memory, though, that returned more often than the others. It wasn't dramatic. No grand moment. Just something simple, almost ordinary. The kind of memory most people might forget. But not him. A quiet afternoon. A shared smile. The sound of someone close to him laughing without worry, without fear. That memory lived in the spaces between his rides, in the pauses when the engine stilled and the silence grew deeper. And somehow, that motorcycle was tied to it. Not in a way that could be explained easily. There were no photos, no proof, no story he ever told anyone. But every time his hands wrapped around the handlebars, every time he leaned into a turn or slowed at a red light, it was there, woven into the experience, inseparable from the machine itself. It wasn't just about riding. It was about remembering. And maybe, in some quiet, unspoken way, holding on. The city lights blurred softly as he rode past them, each one flickering like a passing thought. He didn't chase them. He didn't need to. Out here, there was nothing to prove, nothing to perform. Just a man, his machine, and the road stretching endlessly ahead. For a moment, he slowed, stopping at an empty intersection where the world seemed to pause with him. The engine idled beneath him, steady and patient. He looked ahead, eyes calm, but distant, as if seeing something far beyond the road in front of him. Then, almost instinctively, his grip tightened slightly. Not out of control, but out of connection. Because this wasn't just a motorcycle. It was freedom. It was escape. And more than anything, it was a piece of his past he wasn't ready to lose. The call came when the night was at its quietest. Keanu had just parked, the engine of his motorcycle fading into silence as the world seemed to hold its breath. For a moment, everything felt still, until his phone vibrated in his pocket, sharp and out of place in the calm. He almost didn't answer. Not because he didn't care, but because something inside him already knew. This call carried weight. He finally picked up. The voice on the other end wasn't steady. It trembled, trying to stay composed but failing in the spaces between words. A doctor. Careful. Measured. But urgent. His sister. The word alone was enough to shift everything. There was no dramatic reaction at first, no sudden panic, just silence, the kind that sinks deep, pressing against the chest, making it harder to breathe with each passing second. He listened, unmoving as the details unfolded. Serious condition, immediate treatment, complications. Time was not on their side. His gaze drifted slowly toward the motorcycle beside him, its metal still faintly warm from the ride. Just moments ago, it had been his escape. Now it felt distant, almost irrelevant against the weight of what he'd just heard. "Is there anything we can do?" he asked quietly. The answer wasn't simple. There were options, but not easy ones. Not fast ones. Barriers stood where urgency demanded speed, processes, limitations, delays that didn't care about emotion or love, and love was exactly what this was. When the call ended, the silence returned. But it was no longer peaceful. It pressed harder now, filled with questions that had no immediate answers. For the first time in a long while, Keanu felt something he rarely allowed himself to feel. Helplessness. He sat there, unmoving, eyes fixed somewhere beyond the streetlights. The world hadn't changed, but his world had, and deep down, without saying it out loud, he knew this was only the beginning of a choice he wasn't ready to face. The days that followed didn't feel like days at all, just fragments of time stitched together by worry. Keanu moved through them quietly, making calls, sending messages, reaching out to people who owed him favors and those who didn't. Doors opened, but never wide enough. Every solution came with delay, every promise with uncertainty. And time was the one thing he didn't have. He kept it all to himself. No headlines, no attention. Just silent effort, like always. To the outside world, nothing had changed, but inside, everything was tightening, piece by piece. Late one night, he found himself back where it always led, the motorcycle. It stood waiting, untouched since that call. He walked toward it slowly, almost hesitant, as if approaching it meant admitting something he wasn't ready to face. His fingers brushed against the handle, and for a moment, everything else faded. No hospitals, no pressure. Just the familiar, stillness. But this time, it didn't bring peace. It brought a question. One he couldn't ignore anymore. He stood there longer than he meant to, his hand resting on the handle as if the answer might rise through the metal into his chest. Memories came back, clearer this time, a voice beside him. A laugh carried by the wind. A promise made without thinking it would ever be tested. He closed his eyes briefly. This wasn't just about a machine. It never had been. It was about everything it held, every moment he wasn't ready to let go. But somewhere between memory and reality, the truth settled in quietly. Some things aren't meant to be kept, no matter how much they mean. His grip tightened slightly, then loosened. And in that small, silent moment, without anyone there to witness it, he made the decision. Not out of logic, but out of love. The morning felt heavier than usual, like the air itself knew what was about to happen. Keanu didn't rush. He never did. But there was something different in the way he moved. Slower, more deliberate, as if every second mattered now in a way it hadn't before. The motorcycle stood where it always had, catching the soft light of early day. For a moment, it looked untouched by everything, unchanged, steady, waiting, just like it always had. He approached it quietly, his eyes tracing every detail. The worn leather seat, the faint marks along the frame, the subtle imperfections that made it his. Anyone else would see an object. He saw years. His hand rested on it again, but this time it lingered longer. Not searching for answers now, just holding on, as if letting go all at once would be too much. A buyer was already on the way. No negotiations, no delays. It had to be quick, clean, necessary. When the car finally pulled up, the sound felt too loud for such a quiet moment. A stranger stepped out, respectful, cautious, sensing that this wasn't just a simple exchange. Keanu didn't say much. He didn't need to. They walked around the bike together, the buyer speaking occasionally, asking small questions. Keanu answered softly, but his attention wasn't really there. It was somewhere deeper, somewhere the words couldn't reach. Then came the pause, the final moment. The keys sat in his hand, heavier than they should have been. For a brief second, time stretched. The world around him faded, leaving just him and the machine that had carried so much of his life. He could still walk away. He could still say, no, but he didn't. With a quiet breath, he extended his hand. The keys changed ownership in the simplest motion, but it felt like something far greater had shifted, something unseen, something deeply personal. No dramatic goodbye. No last ride, just a small nod, and silence. The buyer thanked him, but Keanu barely registered the words. His gaze stayed on the motorcycle as it was rolled away, as if committing every detail to memory one last time. And when it was gone, the space it left behind felt louder than any engine ever could. He stood there for a while, hands empty now, the weight still lingering even without the keys. But beneath the loss, there was something else. Not relief, not yet. Just the quiet understanding that some things aren't meant to stay with us forever, no matter how much they once meant. And this time, he hadn't let it go for himself. The hospital corridors felt colder than they should have. Keanu walked through them with quiet urgency, the sound of his footsteps soft but steady, as if he were trying not to disturb the weight of the moment pressing in from all sides. Everything here moved differently. Time stretched, voices lowered, hope and fear existing side by side in every glance. He reached her room and paused for just a second before stepping inside. She looked smaller than he remembered. Not fragile, just tired. The kind of tired that didn't come from a long day, but from something deeper, something heavier. Machines hummed gently around her, steady and indifferent, marking time in a way that felt almost unfair. For a moment, he didn't speak. He just stood there, taking it in, as if trying to memorize every detail, not out of fear, but out of love. Then he moved closer. Her eyes shifted slightly, finding him. And despite everything, she smiled. It wasn't strong, not full, but it was real. And that was enough to break something inside him. "You're here," she whispered. He nodded, pulling a chair closer, sitting beside her without hesitation. Always. There was so much he could have said, so much he wanted to say. But the words didn't come the way they should. They never did in moments like this. Instead, he reached for her hand, holding it gently, as if even the smallest pressure mattered. "I took care of it," he said quietly after a moment. "You're going to be okay." It wasn't a promise he could guarantee, but it was one he needed her to believe. Her fingers tightened slightly around his, a silent response, full of trust. No questions. No doubt. Just belief in him, the same way it had always been. Outside the room, things were already in motion. Arrangements made, payments processed. The cost of it all carried quietly on his shoulders, unseen by anyone else. But here, none of that mattered. Here, it was just them. Minutes passed slowly, filled with soft breaths and unspoken thoughts. At times, her eyes drifted closed, her grip loosening, then finding his hand again as if she needed that connection to stay anchored. And each time, he was still there. Unmoving. Unwavering. But, as the hours slipped by, the tension grew. Nurses came and went. Doctors spoke in careful tones. There were moments where everything felt stable, and others where uncertainty crept in like a shadow no one could quite push away. One moment in particular stayed with him. A sudden shift. Subtle, but enough. Voices quickened. Movements sharpened. The calm broke, just slightly, but enough for him to feel it deep in his chest. He didn't panic. He didn't move. He just held her hand tighter. Because sometimes, that's all you can do. Time blurred after that. Seconds felt like minutes. Minutes felt like something far longer. The kind of waiting that tests everything: patience, strength, belief. And still, he stayed. Not as the man the world knew. Not as someone with influence. Or power. Just a brother, sitting beside his sister, hoping that everything he had given up would be enough to bring her back. And in that quiet, fragile space between fear and hope, everything hung in the balance. The night outside the hospital had changed without anyone noticing. Somewhere beyond the glass walls, life kept moving. Cars passing, lights flickering, people rushing toward places they thought mattered more than time itself. But inside that room, everything was reduced to something much simpler. Breath. Silence. Waiting. Keanu hadn't left. He sat in the same chair, his posture unchanged, as if moving might break the fragile balance holding everything together. Fatigue had settled in quietly, but he ignored it. There were things stronger than exhaustion now. At some point, news began to arrive, not in loud announcements, but in careful, cautious updates. Stability, then progress. A response to treatment, small improvements. Each phrase landed like a quiet relief he didn't fully trust yet. He didn't celebrate, not immediately. He had learned that hope, when rushed, could hurt just as much as loss. But something in the room had shifted. Her breathing was steadier now. The machines no longer sounded as tense. Even the doctors spoke with less urgency, more reassurance. Still, he stayed close. Because healing, he knew, didn't happen all at once. It came in pieces, slow, uncertain, fragile. At one point, she opened her eyes again. This time longer. She looked at him, really looked, as if trying to find her way back through fog. "You didn't leave," she whispered. A faint smile crossed his face. "I told you I wouldn't." There was a pause between them, simple but full. No need for explanations. No need for anything beyond presence. Outside the room, something else was happening quietly. The story of what he had done, what he had given up, had started to spread. Not through loud headlines, not through his own voice, but through people who had seen enough to understand that something meaningful had taken place. And then something unexpected followed. One act became another. Then another. Strangers stepped forward. Help arrived where it wasn't asked for. Doors that had once stayed closed began to open in ways no one could explain fully. It wasn't loud. It wasn't organized, but it was real. And Keanu never once took credit for it. He didn't even seem to notice it forming around him. Because his world was still right here, in a quiet hospital room, holding on to something far more important than recognition or explanation. Hours passed like that, and for the first time in days, the weight in the air felt slightly lighter. Not gone, but shifting, as if something broken was slowly, carefully beginning to find its shape again. The morning arrived quietly, almost unsure of itself. Light slipped through the hospital windows in soft layers, touching everything without. Hurry! The room no longer felt like a place suspended between fear and hope. It felt calmer, like something had finally settled. Keanu sat where he had been all night, but now there was a subtle change in him. Not relief yet, not joy, but something closer to disbelief slowly turning into understanding. A doctor stepped in, this time without urgency in their voice. "She's stable," they said gently. "She's responding well." For a moment, the words didn't fully register, not because they weren't clear, but because he had stopped allowing himself to believe too quickly. Then, he looked at her. She was awake, not struggling, not fading, just there. And when she saw him, a faint smile returned, this time stronger than before, real enough to reach him properly. "You stayed," she said softly. He exhaled slowly, as if he'd been holding that breath for days. "I said I would." Silence followed, not empty, but full in a different way, the kind of silence that doesn't need filling. Outside, life continued as it always had. But inside that room, something had shifted permanently. Not just her condition, but something deeper between them. Something unspoken, rebuilt in the quiet spaces of endurance. Days later, when she was strong enough to leave the room for short walks, she asked him about the motorcycle. He didn't answer immediately, not because it hurt, but because it meant something had come full circle. "I had to let it go," he said finally, his voice steady. "To make sure you stayed." She looked at him for a long moment, processing more than just the words. Then she nodded slowly, understanding without needing more explanation. What neither of them knew was that the story had already moved beyond them. Somewhere out there, the motorcycle had not simply disappeared into ownership and transaction. It had found its way back, not as it was before, but restored quietly, carefully, as if the world itself had decided it couldn't remain lost, and with it came a simple note. No name attached. No attention sought, just a message that carried more weight than anything else. Some things given in love never truly leave you. Keanu read it without speaking. For a long time, he just held the note, letting it sit quietly in his hands. And this time, he didn't look back at what he had lost. He looked at what had returned. Because in the end, it was never really about the motorcycle. It was about what it made possible and what it proved, without needing to say it out loud, that even the deepest sacrifice can come back as something gentler than loss, something like healing.